Hello everyone and welcome to Java Curriculum Day 4. My name is Joanne Lin and I'm serving as the founder and CEO of My STEM project, and I'm so excited to be here with you guys today. So the first thing that we're going to be covering is if conditions. So if conditions are logical conditions. So something like if something is bigger than another, then you do this. Or if something is true or if something is false, then you do this. So let's get into a demo of what this means. So let's start on a blank page and we're going to focus on our first if condition. So let's say we want to do if 6 is smaller than 8, then we will do our brackets, enter. So these two brackets right here show that our code for the if statement will be included in these two brackets. So then the program or the computer knows where our if statement is and what block of code to execute. So if 6 is smaller than 8, then let's do system.out.print 6 is smaller than 8. Alright. So now we should be expecting that the terminal will have 6 is smaller than 8. Let's press run. And as you can see here, it does say 6 is smaller than 8. Now, let's say if 6 is bigger than 8, then we'll see nothing in the terminal. So if we do that, you can see that nothing has been printed, which is exactly what we want. So that is how an if statement works. Now we'll be moving on to loops. So loops help execute a block of code for a repeated amount of times until it is told to stop. And there's so many loops in Java that you guys could be using. And these loops also help save time and space for the code. So the first thing that we'll cover is while loops. And these are loops that have a specific condition and they only run when that specific condition is true. So once the condition is false, then the loop will stop running. Alright, now we're back at Visual Studio Code for a demo of a while loop. So let's say for our while loop, we want to make it while. Let's first initiate a variable. So let's say int my test is equal to 5. So while my test is bigger than 2, then we'll run the piece of code inside of these brackets. So let's do system.out.print my test. So this will print out what our variable my test is into the console for every iteration. And then in the bottom we can do my test subtract 1. So these two minus signs, if you put two of them together, that means you'll be subtracting 1 from the integer. That's just a shortcut of how to do it. Otherwise, you could be writing my test is equal to my test minus 1. So basically, these two are the exact same thing. Alright, so let's run this code and see what is printed into the console. Now, as you can see, it prints 5, 4, and 3. So my test starts at 5. So in the first iteration, this is true because 5 is bigger than 2. So it'll print out 5. Then it subtracts 1 to become 4. And 4 is still bigger than 2, so it'll print out 4. And then it subtracts 1 to become 3, which is still bigger than 2, so it prints out 3. And then it'll become 2. But 2 is not bigger than 2. It's the same, but that isn't written here. So then it stops running this while loop, which shows because it's not printed out here. So that is how a while loop works, and now we'll move on to for loops. So for loops and while loops are pretty similar, but it's just the difference in that the for loops is you have a specific amount of times that you want the code to loop through. So instead of making it like a while loop where you're like, oh, if this is true, then you do it until it's not true. For loops are do this for a specific amount of times that I specify. So let's get into an example of how to do a for loop. So when we're back at Visual Studio Code, let's keep our variable my test that we implemented, and let's start writing our for loop. So it'll be for. So there's 3 statements in a for loop, and I'll write that out right now. So we'll start with an int I is equal to 0. Now, this is the first statement, and this basically means we're initiating an integer named I. And this I integer will be only used in this for loop. It won't be applicable to anything outside of this for loop. And this I is basically our index. It helps count for us. And once the I reaches the maximum that we will specify later on, then the for loop will stop. So now we'll say I is smaller than 3. So this is saying that I will continue running until it becomes bigger than 3 because I need to say smaller than 3 in order for this for loop to run. For the last statement, we'll be specifying how much is going to be added onto our integer I after every single iteration. So the most common is I++, and this means that after every iteration of the for loop that we'll be going through, I will be adding 1 onto it. So let's say the first time we go through it, I will be 0. Then the next time it'll be 1, 2, 3, and so on. So now let's do our brackets. And we can delete this variable because it's not needed. So now here we can say system.out.print, and we'll print out I. So this will basically print out whatever this variable is at the time during the iteration. And then let's run this to see what happens. So as you can see, it prints out 0, 1, and 2. And that's because just like the while loop where it printed out 5, 4, and 3, after 3 iterations of this for loop, the I became bigger than 3, so it couldn't run anymore. And that's how a for loop works. Now moving on, we'll talk about a nested loop. So this is basically a loop inside of another loop. So going back to Visual Studio Code, if we have a for loop just like this, then inside of it we could have another for loop. So I'll initiate another one, and this time I'll name it J so that the variables from the outside and the inside don't match, because that'll pop up an error, and it'll also just be very hard to organize if both of these integers have the same name. So we'll start in J at 0 again. We'll do J is smaller than 3. And then J++. So now let's move this inside. And since we're running this 3 times for every single iteration of this, that means that this will be printing out 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, 2, 2, 2, because that is just a logic of the for loop, nested for loop that we used. So as you can see, it does print out 0, 0, 0, 1, 1, 1, and 2, 2, 2. And now we'll talk about break and continue. So the break statement helps you jump out of a loop completely, and the continue statement just helps you move on to the next iteration of a for loop. So as you can see on the bottom right of this slideshow, this shows different examples of the break and continue. So here it says for int I is equal to 0, I is smaller than 10. That's our for loop. So after I becomes bigger than 10, then the for loop will not run anymore. And it says if I is equal to 4, then you'll break. That means you'll completely get out of this for loop. So after I hits 4, then you'll not be running this for loop again. And now moving on to continue, this is the exact same thing except it says continue instead of break. So because of this, that means it'll skip the 4th round of this for loop and then move on to the 5th one directly. So there won't be a system.out.print for this iteration. Alright, and now we can move on to functions, or if you would like to call it methods. So functions and methods are the same thing, they're just 2 words that I use interchangeably. So throughout these videos and these next lessons that you'll be seeing throughout the rest of the weeks, you will hear that we will be using functions and methods interchangeably, and just know that they are the exact same thing. They don't mean anything different, there's just different words that we say that have the same exact meaning. So a function or a method is a block of code that runs when something in the program calls on it. So this basically helps the programmer to clean up their code because you can reuse this section of the code repeatedly and however many times you want. So this is just a little showing of how to write a function. So this static part is added to show that the function created is in the main class and not an object of it. You will learn more about this in the future, as this may be confusing to you since you don't know what classes are or objects are yet. But in the future, if you want to come back to this video, then you'll see that you'll understand what we mean in this sentence. But for now, just disregard it. Next is the void. So this is where you'll show the returning value. So right now, since it says void in our function, we won't return anything. But let's say we wanted to return in the function, we wanted to return like an integer. Then we'll say static int and then my method. So if you want to return a string, then you do static string my method and so on. So then my method is the name of the function that we're creating. So you can name it anything you want. It's just the function name that you'll be using. So make it something that'll be memorable and relevant to your code. So let's go into an example of how to make a function. So once we get back into Visual Studio Code, we can exit out of the public static void main. Just get out of those brackets and don't be in them. So still be in the brackets of the public class app though, these two yellow brackets, because you need to be in that for your code to be working. So let's create a static, and let's say I want to return an integer. So I'll do int, and I'll say my method. So I just created my first function. And now in here, I'll just say system.out.print hello. So now, after it says hello, then I'll say I want to return 2. So since I've done this, now I can call on my function. In this method, I'm going to be calling this function. And how you do that is write down the function name, do your parentheses, and then just do a semicolon. And this will help you call the function. But since I return a 2, which is my integer, I want to do something with that. So let's say I want to create a variable named integer sum of all, and I'm going to start it at 0. So now I'm going to say sum of all is equal to sum of all plus my method. So in addition to printing out hello into the console, it'll also return 2, which is added onto sum of all. So let's continue doing this for a few iterations. So let's do 3 of those. So let's do 3 of those. And then in the end, I'll say system.out.print sum of all. And we can see that the sum of all should be adding up to 6 because we're adding 2 each time and we have 3 iterations of it. So let's run it. And as you can see, it prints out hello 3 times, which is the exact number of times that we called my method. And it also prints out 6 at the end, which is what we wanted as well. So that is how a method or function works, and how the return variable works as well, and how you call it. So that was the end of day 4 information. Don't forget to check Google Classroom and complete the assignment for today. The assignment for today is a factorial assignment, and you can get more information about that on Google Classroom. Thank you for watching and have fun coding.